Meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, ladies and gentlemen, chers amis, mesdames et messieurs, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the Canadian Embassy tonight. And without further ado, I would introduce Jennifer May, our Deputy Head of Mission and Minister, a great friend and a great supporter of this program. Jennifer.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren, Mesdames et Messieurs, Dr. Diamond, lieber Herr Gansing, der mir verloren gegangen ist, da, hinter dem Papier, ja, and all of you in the audience. Es ist mir eine besondere Freude, Sie heute zu der 9. transmediale Marshall McLuhan Lecture begrüßen zu dürfen. Bienvenue à tous et toutes ici à l'Ambassade du Canada. Für die transmediale McLuhan Lecture werden Persönlichkeiten der kanadischen Kulturszene eingeladen, die in ihrer Arbeit und mit ihrem Denken Marshall McLuhans zeitloses Verständnis für Medien und Technologie aktuelle Aspekte erweitern. I'm particularly honored to welcome Dr. Sara Diamond as a 2016 McLuhan Lecturer to the Canadian Embassy and to Transmediale. Sara Diamond is the president of OCAD University, the Ontario College of Art and Design in Toronto, Canada's largest and oldest educational institution for art and design. She studied history, communications, and digital media theory in Canada and the United Kingdom and holds a PhD in computing, information technology, and engineering. Consistent with McLuhan's interdisciplinary approach, Dr. Diamond is not only a renowned researcher and educator in the field of new technology and media, but also a media artist herself. Her videos, installations, and broadcast works have been screened and presented in exhibitions around the world and can be found in the collections of the National Gallery of Canada, the Vancouver Art Gallery, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Prior to joining OCAD, Dr. Diamond founded the Banff New Media Institute and became its artistic director, and then later its director of research. While at Banff, she was active in creating national and international networks of new media practitioners, including the organization of think tanks for Indigenous artists, producers, and critics. Later at OCAD University, she played a leading role in setting up a unique Aboriginal visual culture program. Indigenous issues have been at the core of her work, along with social issues and modern-day working conditions, especially for women. In her transmediale McLuhan Lecture, Dr. Diamond will draw from her experience as a historian of society, technology, and media, as well as from her collaborations with scientists and new media artists. Inspired by the overall festival theme of transmediale, she will analyze the frequently shifting definitions in the understanding of anxiety, which have formed the discourse on feminist issues. In the spirit of McLuhan, she will explore the challenges and the possibilities for interdisciplinary work between art, science, and technology. In particular, she will consider the role of women in media art and research, within the context of the revival of critical discussions on this topic in recent years. Dr. Diamond, a warm welcome to Berlin and a welcome to Transmediale. It is a great pleasure to have you here today. And before I turn the floor over to Dr. Gansing, and of course to you, Dr. Diamond, let me quickly tell you about the other events in this year's Transmediale Marshall McLuhan program. The Embassy's Marshall McLuhan Salon is pleased to be once again a venue for Transmediale and provides a forum for important and innovative projects. Together with Transmediale, this Saturday we'll be presenting a new edition of the discussion series McLuminations, moderated by Baruch Gottlieb and featuring media researchers Andrew Clement and Steffi Winkler. The Embassy's Marshall McLuhan Archive is one of the largest audiovisual collections of the legendary media philosopher outside of Canada. In the McLumination session, participants will interact with McLuhan's ideas through video clips from the archive, warming up the cool media of video through a stimulating live exchange. During Transmediale, we will have special opening hours at the McLuhan Archive, and you're invited to explore our collection on your own or to join the introduction by Steffi Winkler on Friday at 2 p.m. And I'll be there too. This program has greatly benefited from the exceptional collaboration we've had over the last 9 years with Transmediale. The Embassy is very honored to be a partner of this outstanding and engaging festival. Vielen Dank, Herr Gansing. Last but not least, I would like to especially welcome Jamie Allen, Canadian researcher and 2004 Transmediale artist in residence, who will serve as our moderator tonight. Mesdames et messieurs, je vous remercie de votre attention et vous souhaite tous et toutes une excellente soirée. And now over to you, Christopher Gansing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy Ambassador Jennifer May, for this kind introduction. It is indeed always a pleasure to be able to present this lecture here at the Canadian Embassy. I would like to extend a heartfelt thank to everybody who actually makes this event possible every year. Because, it stretches now over almost a decade, as was already mentioned, and it's the 5th time that I have the honor to introduce the Marshall McLuhan Lecture and the 9th in the series. It comes together as a cooperation of really wonderful people here at the Embassy and in the transmediale teams. I would especially like to thank Katarina Fischner for her engagement, always in making this happen. Also David Ainger and Andrea Bögner here at the Embassy. I'd like to mention also Sara Teurer from our transmediale team, who's bravely now documenting by video camera over there in the corner of the lecture. She took over the practical duties from our side of handling this series of events. The yearly Transmediale Marshall McLuhan Lecture presents outstanding interdisciplinary thinkers that work in the visionary spirit of McLuhan in terms of reflecting on relations between art, technology, and society. That means that the lectures do not address necessarily McLuhan's work directly, but rather the series extends McLuhan's discussion on the influence of media technologies on art and society in a contemporary setting. And in this sense, for me and for Transmediale, the McLuhan Lecture is a really central event in the program. I always see it as a kind of kick-off keynote speech that informs the discussions that will happen later on during the actual festival in the HKW. And I think that function of the McLuhan Lecture is very fitting this year, since we have the title, Conversation Piece. And this title is to be understood very literally as the meaning of conversation piece, as an object or a topic that is kicking off the discussion. And in this sense, we're using it also not so much as a theme, but as a format. And in our adaptation of this conversation piece format, we will, of course, encounter also a lot of unusual objects. Those are usually some artworks or some topics from digital culture. So, to some extent, Transmediale is always a conversation piece. But this year, we want to put this kind of more dialogic or forum-like aspect of the Transmediale into the foreground, rather than to have some of our, I should mention, excellent, but still very monumental themes from the past years, like the 2 recent ones only, Afterglow and Capture All. They are not kind of overshadowing everything that's happening. It's kind of more of an inverse approach to the thematics. But there are questions and the topics, themes that run through the program, of course. Something that we're addressing is how to create new vocabularies to deal also with the kind of challenges and crises that faces our society in the context of kind of global networking of digital and also at the same time very dispersed information flows. What are the common grounds on which we can at all have a conversation today? And how do we deal with the anxieties that underpin that or underlie that conversation? And for this very broad, ambitious purposes, we have structured the main glut of the program along 4 streams that function as, you may say, the actual conversation pieces. These streams zooms in on a particular aspect of digital culture where there is an anxiousness felt today. So somehow the anxiousness of how to do something, of how to go further at all. You could think about these streams as kind of disrupted ideal scenes of digital culture. And they all take their starting point in different anxious states where we are kind of caught between action and inaction. Just mention the name of these streams. They are 4 and they're called anxious to act, anxious to make, anxious to share, and anxious to secure. Well, I can do a quick speed run about what that means. Anxious to act deals with the compulsive to kind of always be active through media and asks, what is media activism today? Anxious to make looks at the kind of mainstreaming of DIY media culture into the more mainstream context of the maker culture and how that also intersects with industry politics. The anxious to share stream looks at whatever became of the sharing economy and what kind of alternatives are now developing to the sharing and economizing of resources. And finally, there's secure, anxious to secure stream. We look into contemporary cultures of security, but also how we come to embody security attitudes and measures in our daily lives. And I'm pretty sure that tonight's speaker, Dr. Sara Diamond, will both directly and implicitly touch on all of these topics in her talk. As already mentioned, as a president currently of the OCAD University, Ontario, she's not only a very renowned researcher and educator in the field of art and design, but also, if you look at her CV and you know her work, really a true polymath with a long history of outstanding technology research and artistic practice, as well as also being an activist in gender and indigenous issues. Her CV was already covered. I would like to mention that Sara Diamond has actually shown work back at the Transmediale, back in the day when it was called VideoFest. I recently stumbled upon an article about the 1990 festival and saw that Diamond's video $10 or Nothing, which we might see an excerpt of tonight. It was part of her Women's Labor History project that was screened at the VideoFest 90. I was not around the Transmediale at that time, but I think I'm entitled to say that we're very happy to have you back, Miss Diamond. So, Sara Diamond will speak tonight under the title Anxious to See Change, and she's promised us a wide-ranging response to the themes of this year's Transmediale, including a reflection on how anxiety in different ways have influenced her feminist concerns around her practice, how it relates also to revival of this issue today, for example, through initiatives like FemTech, which have been present at the recent Transmediales. After the lecture, I will introduce Jamie Allen, who will serve as the respondent and the moderator of the conversation and Q&A after the talk. And now, please warmly welcome Sara Diamond to the 2016 Marshall McLuhan Lecture.
Hello, everybody. Just going to start my clock here. There we go. Okay. Great. So the title of my talk is Anxious to See Change, and it's a statement of hope and frustration in the context of 3 centuries of feminist activism. So we've heard about what I'm about to speak on, but I want to wander a little bit chronologically on the persistent state of anxiety, anxieties, and cures that have informed feminist concerns over the now many decades of my own life. And speaking of anxiety in this way, I will inevitably touch on the actual disease, but I'm primarily using the term as a metaphor or condition. Psychoanalysis plays a crucial, and there's our friend Marshall. Psychoanalysis plays a crucial role in setting the stage for anxiety to be understood as the framing device of the modern and postmodern eras. A reality-oriented automatic anxiety from primary trauma that overwhelms the subject, helplessness at birth in Freud's terms in the first instance, neurotic anxiety in which the subject anticipates reprisals, replays of these situations, mediated by ego in achieving sophisticated expressions, hysteria, somatization of traumatic memory in the body, anxiety triggering the limbic system. Most common expressions are panic attacks, social anxiety disorder, phobias, general anxiety disorder. In other words, actual, legitimate traumas produce fears of their reenactment. According to Freud and psychologists who followed anxiety after his path, it is a healthy protective reaction. However, it can amplify and individuals can lose control as, if we lose the metaphor, can societies. In theory, one can protect oneself against reoccurrence or develop a cure or method to confront the fear. Of course, Freud's favorite method, perhaps like transmediale this year, was the talking cure. The concept of an age of anxiety is long-reaching and bridges the 20th and 21st centuries, beginning with World War I and the brutal and post-event, apparently senseless loss of life, through the Great Depression, reoccurring with post-war Europe and America. And the age of anxiety found its ways into post-war culture. The Baroque Eclogue was written in 1947. the first UK edition in 1948. It is a long poem in 6 parts by Auden. Symphony number 2, The Age of Anxiety, from 1948 to 49 in the US, and Israel by Leonard Bernstein. And then the symphony was the inspiration of a 1950 ballet by Jerome Robin, and The Wisdom of Insecurity, then later by Alan Watts. Now, within this discourse, women are seen as particularly prone to neuroses and anxiety as we lack. And we lack subjectivity, we lack agency. There were points of resistance, certainly to this characterization of women as neurotic and without subjectivity, and aptly named Karen Horney attempted to retrieve an autonomous female sexuality and by extension a valid form of feminine existence, appealing to a genuinely independent nature and holding culture culpable for women's subordinate status, by casting women's otherness as an effect not only of social situations and their power relationships, but also of their choices, and hence responsibility. Of course, famously, Simone de Beauvoir preserves women's freedom in The Second Sex and some of her wonderful statements. And so this is very much about positioning the subject in the age of the female subject in the age of anxiety, and this discussion happened many decades ago. My own contribution as a labor historian and artist who studied the work of women in the late 19th up to the mid-20th century, ending in the 1950s, was the creation of an artist television series entitled The Lull Before the Storm, in which a 2-part drama followed a woodworker family, Dorothy, George, and Bobby, through the late 30s and into the early post-war years, starting in the lumber camps, through Dorothy's work in the war industry, and then back home after the war. 2 documentary episodes were shot with woodworker communities on Vancouver Island. Nothing much happens in the video, while Dorothy, the working-class maternal figure and wife, moves deeper and deeper into obsessive-compulsive disorders and commodity fetishism, and George the father languishes on the assembly line. Bobby does get larger, and George won't let Dorothy work. She yearns for her former working life and her ex-lover, and her pinkish, soft, radical past. While Dorothy remains at home scrubbing the floor, there's a constant framing by a voiceover narrator, Mr. Gray, and a series of mostly ironic panel discussions about the changing status of women. All this fantasy is intercut with exemplary historical footage from the times in question. So the dramas are written as an anti-narrative, although understanding her own anxieties, Dorothy finally acts. She finds a cure. When Bobby is old enough, she goes back to waitressing, which is where the plot began in the 1930s, leaving her boys to their television dinner, their TV dinner. So the age of anxiety circulates. It is again discussed in the 90s as the simulacra and speed of late capitalism revs up, and reappears in works by theorists such as Andrew Ross. In his context, the first instances of traumas are delivered by hyper-realistic news media, not necessarily experienced by birth or actual experiences of alienation or oppression, adding a layer of complexity to analysis and action. By the 21st century, general anxiety is being broadened as a condition within the annals of psychiatry's categories in the DSM. It's the #1 prescription at pharmacies in North America, and 3/4 of these are for anxiety. By age 32, 50% of Americans will qualify with anxiety disorder, and women patients figure large within each of these categories. So my interest from the feminist perspective is that there is a real trauma and the cure needs to respond. Anxiety is a terrific dis-ease, a discomfort with forms of oppression that can be medicated with activism. So I want to start a little bit, and I'll keep kind of moving through, although my worldview, anxieties, and cures have changed with time, there are some constants as the Northern Lights, as Joni Mitchell would say. There's a pervasive interest in emerging technoculture and technoscience, founded on a link to a materialist analysis of technology, its formative effects on humans, and in verso, and that humans design and build technologies with a sense of purpose and ideological assumptions at their core, which they often don't recognize. Of course, there's no direct one-on-one visible ratio between what technologies are meant to do and how we understand them, let alone how we finally deploy them. And there is much mystification in the process. But this kind of materiality is critical to the understanding of the role and potential of agency within the context of technology. So to start with second wave feminism of the 1970s and 1980s, and you can see how I've sort of organized this. The anxieties, and you can read them, I won't necessarily repeat them, but it's about control of the body, our bodies, healthcare that respects the woman's body, the control of sexuality, and in particular an end to violence. And cures included bearing witness, pro-choice campaigns, Our Bodies, Ourselves, anti-violence campaigns, rape shelters, and battered women's shelters. Just to give you a sense of some of that discourse at the time. The technologies at hand here are many, including birth control, safe abortion tools, and even the architecture and structure, of the household in terms of women's experience of violence within it. In the late 70s and early 80s in Vancouver, there was a time of passionate and contradictory debates around the heady rise of identity politics. The pro-choice movement was part of a larger drive by women to control our bodies ourselves, our sexuality, our images. And socialist feminists were always present in the fight for reproductive rights from the 1930s and again in the 50s to the 60s. The fight for birth control waged, although earlier with a eugenics edge, but later in more universal terms, and was finally won in Canada in 1968, which is not that long ago, and then moved on to the right to choose. This movement had a materialist analysis, and interestingly, the movement against violence against women and sexual violence was driven by feminists, including separatists and lesbians, less engaged by women on the left. And while repudiating sexism, these forces were more prone to arguments sustaining ideas of biological difference. Issues of sexuality were entwined with the women's movement's fight to control our bodies, but played out in different ways, and issues of violence were also integral to the fight for control. Also central to another leverage set of anxieties is the notion of control over media. So how are these anxieties expressed? We feel stereotyped by the images in the world. It's an incredible weight in terms of our ability to be in the world. Media images make me feel terrible about myself and other women. We don't see ourselves anywhere. We're never shown as powerful when together. And so the cures, and I hope you see what I'm trying to say here, which is there's this set of sort of social anxieties that kind of underpin the forces of organization and expression, and then move into a series of cures, the creation of feminist media content and production contexts in order to provide alternatives, campaigns for positive imagery and against sexist images, the idea of women getting behind the camera and subsequent emerging technologies, and then representation as a pervasive kind of issue. So Amelia Productions, which was made up of Billy Carroll, Gay Hawley, Sara Davidson, Ellen Frank, was one of several women's media collectives based in Vancouver. It endured from 1990 to 1982. Its members included activists in the socialist, lesbian, feminist community, such as the Women's Press, who are engaged in a variety of larger activist social movements, and leftist activists in recovery. That was me. Amelia's perspectives on video bear similarities to the tactical media movement of the 1990s and early 2000s. We jokingly dubbed our tapes, quote, occupational videos, as these were often shot within occupied buildings, daycare centers and transition houses under threat of closure, the Canada Post Office occupied by striking workers, telephone operators in BC Tel occupied by striking workers, the Department of Indian Affairs occupied by 100 Indigenous women and children. And I have delightful memories of Amelia crews sneaking through police lines, heavy Sony porta-packs strapped to our backs, cameras rolling, confronting angry sheriffs and bringing messages of solidarity. Amelia was consistently invited inside events when professional media were kept out. I'm going to come back to this conversation on race because I've jumped ahead. Sorry here. And Amelia was responding to The anxieties of women in the workplace. We're stuck in pink and white collar ghettos. We don't receive equal pay or equity. I have no rights, maternity benefits, etc., that recognize both of my jobs in the home and in the workplace. I've hit a glass ceiling, so have all my women colleagues. And cures, which included white-collar unionization, the movement to recognize domestic labor, and legislation. So here's some images from Amelia. So as I said, Amelia was consistently invited inside events when professional media were kept out. We sought the immediacy and power of news coverage without its weight. We were strongly aware that tape depended on the interaction of maker, event, and discourse and community. And we would try to respond empirically rather than impose analysis on events. In looking back at these practices, I believe that, quote, while the symbolic power of camera evoked a sense of history and identity within the art community, it was an act of collaboration that was meant to empower the disenfranchised in the making of a documentary, unquote. So really, the relevant political realm of our work was to allow the women to see themselves as they took agency, as they enacted a cure. In 1983, and this is from inside TW Tel, which were striking telephone workers who occupied and ran the telephone company. Here we are inside filming. In 1983, in part in reaction to the debates inside Amelia, I produced the massive installation Heroics in a residency at the Western Front, created by Kate Craig and Tim Guest. It was a 6-part installation that presented itself in 3 domestic sets, a living room, kitchen, and foyer, and suggested the transition to public space. Interested in the formalizing of the interview process, indicating the constructed nature of terms and categories, and genuinely producing counter-definitions of heroism, I used ethnographic methods and sought out women who are willing to ask the question, are you a hero? And it was not a sociologically accurate piece of work, but it used social history and scientific methods to repeat questions to different people and then look at their responses in some kind of consistent way. Sort of early data collection and, in a sense, extraction and visualization. And I interrupted the narrative flow through imposing color photos on top of the interviews, the viewers situated within the comfortable yet uncomfortable reproduction of the domestic set, choosing stories they want to hear and then conversing with each other in the gaps. So the talking cure again. So components of the Vancouver women's movement were very strongly supportive of liberation movements overseas and worked closely with waves of refugees, for example, from Chile and Argentina. In the 1980s, there was a heightened awareness of racism and post-colonial discourse, and anxieties that women expressed were about racial stereotyping, exclusion from economic opportunities, specifically directed violence, being subjected to systemic discrimination, and experiencing specific traumas about their identities and their kind of positioning between both the colonial and the post-colonial experience. And cures, again, were engaged in subjectivity and making of agency. And in particular, interestingly, the Invisible Colors Festival, which is organized by Zainab Verji, who is the distribution coordinator at Women in Focus, and Lorraine Chan of the National Film Board of Canada, was a very important event that looked at the intersection, and this is from Yasmin Yawani writing in the catalog introduction, the intersection where race, class, and gender meet. There stands women of color, bearing the burden and the brutality of these triple forces of oppression perpetuated by patriarchy and colonialism. They toil, we toil in the fields and home, and we are unacknowledged. Their labor is taken for granted and rendered invisible, yet their images are most exploited. And the festival was a monumental success, but led to the breakup of Women in Focus and heralded an era of self-organization by racialized women and campaigns to create organizations and ultimately to re-engage many decades later with artists' centers. So the Women's Labor History Project, and we heard like a little bit about it in terms of The Lull Before the Storm, was my primary life work from 1978 to 1995, comprising of the creation of an extensive archive of interviews with working class and labor activist women, a photographic archive, a series of video artworks that were constructed from interviews, found footage, photographs, and dramatic recreations, often in the Brechtian anti-realist tradition. I was very interested in issues of how memory worked for women and how they acted and reenacted empowerment within their communities and their unions. Why were women activists? How did consciousness development? What were the relationships between specific technological environments and forms of activism? Between domestic and paid labor? What were the impacts of local cultures and then later mass culture, as you've seen in Lull Before the Storm, on activism? How did race and indigeneity integrate and play out with sexuality and gender identity? So these are all images from $10 or Nothing, and if we have time at the end, I'm going to play it, and some other images from the Women's Labor History Project. So I'm very interested in this play between the domestic space and women's agency within the domestic space, and their ability to effectively organize within that. And this is another still from the Lull Before the Storm. So moving on to Indigenous experience. So Indigenous experience and issues of Indigenous rights reverberated throughout British Columbia from the 1970s onward. BC was and is unceded territory with articulate and well-organized communities and organizations with nationalist self-determination agendas and identities. Indigenous anxieties are multiple: subjectivity to forced loss of identity, trauma of the residential schools, an environment and livelihood that is being destroyed, the loss of treaty rights and land for Indigenous women, the subjects of extreme violence, objects of extreme violence, the lack of access to education and employment, and communities lacking schools, housing, and health care. Cures, more recently, of course, are truth and reconciliation, and a renaissance, to maybe ironically use that term, of festivals, artwork, exhibition, new media, theater, and literature within the Canadian context. And then I liked the structure of share, secure, act, and make, and for some, the holistic ability to create a cure I thought was very interesting. So land claims and treaty rights around security, education, and cultural organizations in terms of taking action. And one would say the return, of course, to language. Kristen Dowell's research examined the ways that the potent Indigenous media arts community in British Columbia did more than provide new insights on Indigenous experience. And she said, Aboriginal media is more than merely expressive of Aboriginal stories and Indigenous cultural traditions, but is constitutive of Aboriginal society and kinship relationships, a quote. And that's Dana Claxton, a very important media maker and artist and theorist. Loretta Todd, writing in the fall 1987 video guide, says that white cultural missionaries brought video to Indigenous communities, believing Native people would join the global village. Ignoring traditional forms of preservation that communities had maintained, they inappropriately turned cameras on the perceived exotica of dances, culture, and history. However, the benefit was a positive byproduct in that Indigenous producers realized that video was affordable, developed communications networks in education and media, and created educational tools in the struggle for self-government. And I want to underscore video here so many times because, of course, so much of what I'm talking about is predicated on the emergence of the Sony Portapak and the ability to have this kind of mobile technology that artists, documentary producers could control and take and reapply within a different kind of context. So we're going to move on to sex, which is, Freud really thought was the seed of anxiety, so to speak. And, okay, that's great. And some of the issues and questions that came up around anxieties, around sexuality in the 70s, 80s, and 90s in the women's movement, all issues of self-esteem are on the table. I don't meet stereotypes. If I ask for what I want, I will lose my lover. Is lesbianism a political or sexual choice? That was one of my favorite themes I remember from those days. How do I respond to sexual imagery? I am tired of good girls, bad girls. And cures, of course, sex-positive feminism, the lesbian rights movement, then the anti-porn movement, the anti-censorship movement. And I want to talk a little bit about this without drowning in it, which I can, because it was another one of my major themes. So, you know, the sex industry has consistently driven technological innovation, and so was it with video pornography. And of course, the focus on violence against women in the early 80s segued into the rising debate about pornography and censorship, an issue that was to become a brutal dividing point within the women's movement and, in fact, within the lesbian community. I personally walked the picket lines at Red Hot Video, an international porn distributor, which were organized by Media Watch, Rape Belief, Women Against Violence Against Women. We hissed and booed at and derided women who crossed the lines to Red Hot Video to rent videotapes. And as the picket lines continued, some of us added slogans like, porn no, sex yes. But it was evident that we were picketing side by side by the religious right, who did not share these slogans. I realized very clearly that I was on the wrong line. I was walking with the enemy, which is much less interesting than sleeping with the enemy. Then, Red Hot Video was bombed by the Women's Fire Brigade, an amalgam of our self-proclaimed anarchists and lesbian activists, which gave pause to the organizing process. I wrote a text for Parallelogram, an important artist run publication at the time, about pornography called Of Cabbages and Kinks, which led me to become an ardent anti-censorship activist. I did not believe there was a direct link between image and act, and critically, we saw the emergence of radical and resistant media art and documentary practices that responded to sexual oppression and allowed for new expressions of desire. These efforts at times combined a discourse around other forms of oppression, such as gender, race, or national identity. And these took the form of regular screenings at venues all over the country, and curators responded to particular threats of censorship by exhibiting. It was very clear that censors, whether Canada Customs, who had declared vibrators to be publications in order to stop their penetration of the Canadian border, did not have the discretion to understand what was art and what was porn. What is more, gay and lesbian, feminist, and art-based sexual images were seemingly the victims of censorship, not violent, straight pornography. So in November of 1985, BC's Attorney General, Brian Smith, proposed sweeping regulation of all video materials and received support from many women's groups. And the fight was on, and the strategy on the part of those of us who are pro-sex feminists was to curate alternate works about sex in the video format for education and provocation. So without reviewing the entire campaign, the Vancouver Artists League initiated the Coalition for the Right to View, CRTV, as opposed to the Canadian Radio and Television Commission, pun, in December 1985 under the banner Educate, Don't Legislate. We fought both provincial legislation as well as Canada Customs and extension of the criminal code. I was the spokeswoman. Kara Knights and I followed The Heat Is On, which was a series on sexuality, women on art on sex, which we organized, which included screenings of In the Dark by Kim Tomzik and Lisa Steele, which is an uncut long shot of their lovemaking with the artists narrating their sexual and emotional histories live to the audience in the foreground, as well as many workshops and educational outreach to the larger community. We followed this with Visual Evidence, a multi-month series of events about sexuality and sexual images, again using education and provocation. I plied the radio talk show circuit, arguing against the legislation and challenging the government to take us on. And in the June of 1987, Mary Lou McCausland of the BC Film Classification Branch declared a truce and stated that it was important that artists be free to explore and be creative, regardless of the results of their explorations and creativity. And, you know, I think about this particular period of anti-censorship organizing, and I think it's really curious that there's no real discourse right now that I can see from a feminist perspective around the current rising regime of censorship of images, and maybe that'll be part of our conversation as we move forward. So I'm going to talk now about the wave of digital media and the next generation of technologies. And I should mention that by the 90s, efforts to get women positioned behind as well as in front of the camera, had been increasingly successful. There were statistical surveys to set benchmarks. Studio D was in place. Efforts like Women in the Director's Chair, which I led at Banff, co-led at Banff, to train women. And so we're at the moment where there's this incredible emergence of new media. And at the time, I wrote, "The frenetic quality of cyber hype mass an intensity of change with an intensity of stasis equaled only by war. When the lens focuses at last, the focal plane appears blurred. Like the rest of the 20th century, this is a time for questions. What, if anything, is the meaning of women's increasing presence within new media industries, be these communications, content, software, or technology? What are the stakes for the technologically challenged and marginal? What reconciliation could be imagined between the potential of undermining gender identities and the power of asserting categories, especially those denied, class, gender, and race? There's nothing inherent in digital technologies that transforms or subverts gender identities." So, this is a time of tremendously well-expressed anxiety on the part of women, refusing to accept cyberspace as disembodied space, the Cartesian kind of construction, the need to define what it is to be post-human, concern about the quantification of all living things, not wanting to live in a masculine utopia, concern about exclusion from content creation in the new order, and then seeing ourselves excluded from science, technology, design, and coding. And the cures included a vast array of interventions from the Old Boys Network, and Cornelia is here, to FACES, so ways of thinking specifically within the context of cyberculture, how to create a new kind of feminism that understood the centrality of technology and the retheorization of the body within this concept of virtualization, rethinking gender. Of course, Elga Keir Roseanne Stone's work and Sadie Plant's phenomenally utopian discourse. Makers like V&S Matrix, or of course Nancy Patterson, who were playful and used play to engage in the dialogue. Sharing, of course, networks and new media subcultures, and a drive for women to become makers, and in the commercial world, for women to start and own their companies. Some images from V&S Matrix and from the Old Boys Network. Where has she gone? So within this context, the Banff New Media Institute was founded, and it was founded on the need for artists to analyze and intervene into technoculture and science, both on their own and with scientists and engineers. It always had this notion of being deeply cross-disciplinary in its roots, and again, using this sort of context of transmediale, the idea of sharing and addressing social and cultural impacts of technologies, creative discourses that were compelling and injecting artist perspectives and critical theory side by side with science and invention. And to our credit, scientists really were there, they were present. At the same time, being very aware of demographics and ensuring that cultural and racial diversity was present, and then allowing co-production and research opportunities. Euphoria Dystopia is a record of that era. If you haven't gotten the book yet, I highly recommend it. Joking. Banff, the themes at Banff was really kind of action-driven dialogue. The goal was to create access to principles, shift methods, and goals of designing and making, and to recognize the dynamics of Moore's Law, the kind of transformation of digital industries, globalization, the utopian vision to the dystopian, the rise of biotech, social media, e-learning, collaborative technologies, the growth of IoT and sensor systems. This was a phenomenal time if we think back to the 90s and early 20th century. And the themes at the Banff New Media Institute were staying human, so looking at the human, the mécanique, the body in the post-human context, the material known as data, so data as material, as memory, as organization, expression, intelligence, and effects. Physics, perception, and immersion, a sort of visual, the visual as organizing principles, social and individual identities and new media, and then looking at production and distribution and new models of collaboration. So was the Banff New Media Institute and Media and Visual Arts a feminist space? Well, it was run by women, Susan Kennard, Joanne Bazowski, Martha Ladley. It was highly tolerant of bad boys as well as bad girls. So Liv Manovich, Heath Bunting, Josh Portway, Jamie at jamie.org, Jamie Love, Mongrels, etc. And bad girls, Josephine Stars, Natalie Magnon, Cheryl Lirondelle, Brenda Laurel, and others, Candace Hodkins, Susanna Passonen, Fatoumata Conde, Susan Cook. It's legendary numbers of people who passed through Banff. And the themes really attempted to integrate aspects of feminist theory and perspective on more often led by women. Shuli Cheng, Maurice Bustamante, with ideas like nomad, apocalypso at the turn of the century, beauty, computer voice, human vox. And there was a co-production of a lot of significant numbers of new media works by women. So it was a kind of space where discourse could be constructed. And I think so importantly, because it was where it was, and because of this relationship to nature and culture, it was very, this is Jane Prophet's work, it was very difficult to, escape some of the discourse around the fundamental elision between cyberspace, cyberculture, and the virtual, and the physical and biological. So one of the, positive attributions of Banff was the ability to take on the discourse of reframing the cathedral, as I called it, sort of brick by brick as you're building it, which was the call for the adaptability of technology design to accommodate in a fundamental way cultural diversity, not just localizing content. So to really look at what kind of tools would allow participatory authoring, to identify classical biases and tools such as perspectives, and to role model coding and making by artists, often women artists, Cher Duff, Olga Gorinova, of course, with Artists in Code, Hermane Diamante, who is a man, by the way, from Brazil, but to kind of look at that ability to rethink the fundamental machine code of technologies. And one of my favorite projects, which never finalized itself, was Cree++, plus Wolof, both trading languages. And the idea was to try and think about how to build a fundamental authoring tool that would use a new kind of machine language grammar that would be sympathetic to the kind of object-oriented experience of Aboriginal people in different places. Banff was an important resource for the production of collaborative Indigenous new media work, projects combining a sense of historical memory, the renewal of creative forms from the past brought forward in a deep process of collaboration that was speaking the language of spiders. That was 14-person works led by the now deceased Ahasu Muskogwin Istu, made with Aboriginal artists, all of whom had spent time living on the street, with a majority of them women. And Cyber Powwow, led by Skawanati Fragnito and Archer Pachawis, which was staking a claim in the palace world of cyberspace. I want to spend maybe 2 minutes on Code Zebra, because Code Zebra was my second large collaborative creative project that I undertook, which lasted from 1997 to 2007. And it was an intervention, playful and serious, into the lack of effective dialogue between artists and scientists in what appeared to be an attenuated flirtation. I was addressing the rise of biotech and the biological explanation for all phenomena. And there were two other concerns. One was how to create a social media environment beyond IRC chat. This started in '96, so for those of you who were around then, think back on the chat environment. That was lateral, beautiful, and could include games and other toys for rich dialogue. And finally, I'd been long interested in the effective computing world. I wanted to build a sentiment analysis tool that could indicate the styles and zones of conversation for users. I migrated the performance of roles, the scientist, the artist, into animal types, and set out to create a lateral chat software that would facilitate non-hierarchical dialogue through events, conferences, and performances. It was really silly, but it was a very serious project. And it kind of used this idea of zoomorphism and our relationship with how we take on and embody the world of nature around us. It was a good project for Banff. And used reaction diffusion patterns, this sort of living mass of software, so the software kind of undulated and clustered around topics. And actually we did build essentially effective neural networks that could identify 9 animal types, which were based on kind of classic emotional categories extracted from chat behavior. And it had a lot of other events and fun things around it. So one of my favorite activities was, I'll just pause on this. You get to see all my different hair colors too, right? My favorite activity was at the Deaf Electronic Arts Festival, and I have to thank V2, thanks to Anna Nickton now of Patching Zone, who is a stalwart supporter of Code Zebra. So at Deaf, I locked up pairs of artists and scientists into habituation cages. They were under video and internet surveillance with regular engagement of outside moderators, and given the compulsion to collaborate for 24 hours, using the tool and other means to invent something. So it was interestingly productive and unproductive. At some point, as well as software, I decided to create software so that the images of Code Zebra could manifest on textiles and surfaces as part of physical intervention. And I want to talk a little bit about how this then emerges into conversation around new media research networks. I think my stopwatch stopped. Oh, okay, there you go. I'm just going to reset it, so good, thanks. So the Banff Centre was pivotal to women new media artists' inclusion in Canadian new media networks. Leveraging off of the bioapparatus residency curated by Nell Tenhoff and Catherine Richards, which looked at the emerging possibility of virtual reality, Michael Century then funded 10 VR projects, they were back here, in collaboration with Interval Research House, including Tony Dove, Brenda Laurel, Diane Gromula, Kelly Booth, who's a core engineer in Canada, and Michael, and then Kelly and I tried to create a National Centre of Excellence in New Media Research. Ironically, we weren't funded because we were told that digital products would never have an effective place in the global economy. Michael, seconded to Heritage Canada with France Trepanier and others, then created the New Media Research Network Fund, which ran for almost 5 years. So I was co-principal investigator on 2 networks, Am I Able, and the Mobile Digital Commons Network. These consider issues like the localization of media, participatory design, and radical engineering practices. In partnership, for example, with HP Labs, and they truly were science, artist, engineer collaborations, and were highly productive of both theory, methods of working with communities, and a kind of critical discourse, as well as spitting out open source technology. Okay. Partners in 2010-2015, we were finally successful in funding GRAND, a new media research network that included 100 researchers at $25 million, with many women, including its co-principal investigator, Dr. Abby Goodwin, a sociologist. I was on the executive. So I want to talk a little bit to hopefully end, I'm going to try and end in the next 10 minutes, about anxieties, again, about where are the women scientists? You know, why are girls treated as mathematically and technically incapable? Why are women excluded from scientific, physical, and technical job? How can we influence the new science, biotech, gynotech, genetics research, determining of gender? And the stakes are very high. Alzheimer's research and medical science is still very male-focused. So there's huge movements to try and position women in engineering, medicine, and science, to teach gender-neutral mathematics and science, to have role models and mentorship, and then movements for girls to learn code as well as reach-back programs. I'm just throwing you some images from OCAD University, not so much as an advertisement advertisement, but to say, what is the role of a university lab? Art, design, intersectional feminist engagement. I see it very much as being to force subjectivity and agency into the discussion of how and what and for whom technologies are invented. And of course, this is particularly critical with big data, bioscience, and the Internet of Things. It's a fundamental to the idea of undertaking positioned research, which is very unusual in the sciences, and of course comes from social science, in the last decades, emerging with constructivism and the belief that all research is situated. Thinkers such as Bordeaux, of course, argued that ethnographers needed to describe their own biases and be alert to the impact of their presence. So taking this notion into collaborative inquiry, which proposes that researchers must see themselves in the project, so it's grounded in experience and action-oriented, I think is fundamental to a lab like ours at Oakhead University, which is actually this lab, the Visual Analytics Lab, which does work with mechanical engineers, medical doctors, computer scientists, a lot in the space of AI and computational linguistics, cognitive computing, and cognitive scientists, GIS systems engineers, etc. And I think our lab asks different questions and poses them in different ways. We have a very strong ethnographic researcher in our midst, able to seek out the experience and interests of actual users of proposed technologies. And we engage them in playful and in serious manners. We have asked, can interactive, I'm just going to show you some of our work and not describe it, but the images, can interactive ambient visualizations of carbon consumption be developed in ways that engage a community in monitoring carbon control, in monitoring their carbon? Do online media consumers navigate traditional media in non-traditional ways? What constraints are there? Can visualization guide a reader through the online news experience in rhizomatic manners? Can recommendations be meaningful and not limiting? Can these be used to reorder reading and viewing? Can we create an infinite canvas? What stories resonate and for how long? How can we personalize the news experience? Can reading be organized by emotional qualities of a text, not only content? What tools provide analysts What tools can we provide analysts with that are elegant and efficient to understand the real-time movement of topics? And how can visualization tools help communities make critical planning decisions regarding transit and transportation investment? Are there demographic and geographical differences in what matters to transit and transit tool users? And how do patterns differ from the Stats Canada norm of family composition and behavior? Heterosexual, the woman has 3 children by the age of 35, etc. How can we translate these differences into specific tools, and what are the risks of profiling? And how can mobile visualization tools support effective collaboration between families and caregivers and teams that take account the pressures and stresses on women in the family? And finally, do tangible collaborative interfaces engage citizens and allow them to construct their own visualizations from a data set from multiple perspectives? Is cognition and analysis strengthened through embodied interaction with data? So I'm almost finished here. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are now. So I would say I've sort of stepped back from the level of engagement in the 80s and 90s in my own practice, 70s, 80s, and 90s. But in 2009, I was part of putting together a conference that was called Sex, Money, and Media, through a social science and humanities research grant, and working with women in film and television and a group of women around the world, because we saw just this, again, anxiety, lack, absence in the games industry, absence in big science, particularly in big data, absence in the startup sector, and this sort of discourse, which I keep hearing recently, a group of guys in their mid-20s who are starting up companies, who are bio-life inventors, talking about their children, i.e. their technologies, their artificial intelligence technologies. And it harkened me back to 1997 at Digital Burgess, exactly the same conversation. So, I think the cure again is to act, to return to the activism about presence, and at the same time, to see, I think, some positive movement. And I'm not going to talk about the current discourse on anxiety, except that in trolling the internet, what was really great to see were young women who see, in an age when anxiety, as I started with, is becoming this sort of manifold envelope of illness, for, in some ways, the stresses of everyday life, the ways that feminism had provoked the sense of agency and collective identity. So I'm going to end with some of the things that, are preoccupations right now, very quickly, in terms of feminism and some of the cures that are emerging to try and leave us on an optimistic note. So anxieties around the online world being emotionally unsafe, degrading, but also that there's physical manifestations of harm that carry through. And so we're seeing take back the tech, the ability to report violations, site hacking, the creation of safe spaces for women, a kind of shelter separatist community feminist server strategy, which I find harks me back to another era. It's interesting. And of course, working with law enforcement. With the discourse and the rise of technoscience and bioscience, one of the cures is trans-hack feminism, the sort of intersectional space. And by the way, intersectional feminism, I love this word. It's very popular amongst some of my students and faculty. So I guess that's people like me who in the 1970s, 80s thought that sex, class, gender, race were all kind of issues that emerged together. And so it's great to kind of see this back, but within a really interesting addition in terms of understanding queer and trans identities. And with attention to biotech as well as the digital space, and returning to these notions of embodied theory, which of course were so important in terms of Haraway's work and others. And this idea of gender hacking as well as hardware. Just a little scene from a hackathon. Girls Learning Code, Ladies Learning Code. So these are workshops, after-school programs. This kind of came out of Canada, and it's now spreading through North America. Fantastic women who are computer scientists and technologists teaching girls and women how to code. And then some interesting just data points. Women are now the majority of games consumers, computer games of all kind, platform, etc. And interestingly, now women are pushing their way into graduate games programs, even though the numbers and the experience of women in the gaming industry is, absolutely abysmal. I'm not going to share the data on that. And then finally, FemTech Net. Which is, a manifesto. It really tries to bring together some of the legacy of cyberfeminism, feminist theory and critique. And we were involved with a project, again, through a SSHRC grant that Paula Gardner and I were successful with in being able to create these video tools that were conversations with women who had been really critical to technology theory in different kinds of ways. So we looked at performance and technology, difference in technology. And that's now part of an online course, and here's students celebrating that they completed the course. Yay. And so, FemTech, as they say, works at cross-rank to record feminist genealogies and technological innovations of the past, present, and future. I think you all know about the Wikipedia hack that they did, which was fantastic, of really making women present within Wikipedia. And I like this way of ending. I'm just going to read a few things from them, and then my final statement. FemTechNet is a power tool. FemTechNet is distributed expertise. And FemTechNet is an experiment in solidarity. So it has been a long journey. I'm anxious to see change. I did use the bad pun because, a sea change is a dramatic shift of winds and direction that can help us to sail free of debris, yet remaining buoyant. So thank you for listening. Me to go sit there. Okay.
Should have had had a mobile microphone. But thank you very much, Sarah. That was, I think, a timely, inspiring, and also very on-the-point talk. Not only in relation to conversation piece, you covered everything, actually. That's amazing. I will leave the stage now also for the conversation with Jamie. I just want to say that we're happy to have Jamie Allen here, Canadian artist, designer, researcher. Currently, you are based in Basel at the Institute of Experimental Design and Media Cultures, and you're working there also with the Critical Media Lab at Transmediale. We had a collaboration last year and also this year with an unmaking intervention that you can experience at HKW. Like our main speaker, Jamie is also, I would use this word again, polymath, in that you combine theory and practice, and that your CV is far too extensive to walk through here. It was already mentioned that in 2014 you were doing the residency at Transmediale with David Gauthier for the Critical Infrastructure project. Very happy to have you here, and please welcome Jamie and Sarah again.
Oh, thank you.
So thank you, Christopher, and thank you, Transmediale. Hi, everyone. I'm Jamie. And hi, Sarah.
Hi, Jamie.
Thanks so much for that very rich talk. You've given me a lot of anxiety in terms of how to address all of those topics. Just as, I guess, I can open with a quick response that maybe you can respond to, because one of the things that I think has a kinship between what the Transmediale Festival and the conversation pieces and what you were speaking about today, what the commonality there is that there's a way in which you're helpfully evading the kind of binaries that we normally often kind of tend towards when it comes to successes and failures of technological culture, right? So you've also shown us how far we've come and how much kind of opportunity there is there. And so to me, it's like an insertion of the double bind in which media, technology, and the arts always entangles us, never wholly positive or simply negative, right? So instead of these pronunciations of failure that we've actually seen at Transmediale a few times, or success, we hear tonight how we might navigate between the poles of an all-out progressivism and the wholesale cynical pessimism toward a careful ambivalence. The inflexible black box assertion of fact gives way to the deliberate conversation that is never ending. And so I guess maybe as a first kind of prompt, I'm curious, where do you personally maybe get the energy for that infinite conversation? And how do we find a way of keeping it going, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, I have a very privileged job, and there's 4,700 students at OCAD University, and I try and make sure I spend time with them. And go to some of the events that they create. I have open office hours. I've managed to carve out time to lead a lab that has fantastic postdocs and graduate and undergraduate students in it. So for me, that exposure and conversation with emerging intelligence with young people is really of critical importance. And I think I was telling you that our student union organized a day-and-a-half event that was about art and design and social activism, and I was very, and I went to a part of it, which were performances not all of which used technology by any means, but there were components of the work that did, and then a panel, and I was struck by how there is a kind of return to the need to take a position and to say, I am here, I have voice, we are here. So there's still a kind of relevance of identity politics that we often dismiss. And I think it's always important to remind ourselves that when, and a lot of our students, I should mention, are racialized students. So we have a very interesting demographic at our school, and Indigenous, because we've really focused on ensuring that it's a welcoming place. So, I mean, I think it's interesting how something like identity, problematic and problematized as it must be, has this sort of fantastic continuity. Even though it sort of pulled me back, and I was thinking, oh my God, I mean, this reminds me of, I could be somewhere in 1980, except I'm really old and they're really young. There was a kind, it didn't make me nostalgic or didn't make me sad. I, in fact, thought, this is amazing. They're finding this reference in a set of discourses that, were produced during my generation. And there was some amazing work on prisons. So these very young people are doing this phenomenal work within the international prison system. And, why are they doing that? Because it's incredible. And they're using a lot of new media technology, social media to do that, and a kind of aesthetics, from social realism in the 70s. So I just think it's interesting how things kind of recirculate, and theory kind of comes back, and then it kind of gets reconstituted into forms of activism. Maybe very optimistic, even though it wasn't a particularly cheery set of performances.
Yeah, I mean, it does speak to what you mentioned, this kind of idea of holding frustration and hope in the same gesture, and being able to kind of live through that.
At the same time, I am, quite discouraged by a kind of feminist practice, but it's also been decades old, which is very much about self-development, and that whole space was so rigorously co-opted by Oprah Winfrey, and it's part of sales culture, right? So that complexity of relationship about how one does retrieve oneself within capitalism, and how does one identify, in a collective. So what are the opportunities for collective action identification? So the feminist discourse isn't reduced just down to, I must feel powerful in and of myself. So, I think there's a lot of that. And I also find it sort of fascinatingly kind of alarming, but also interesting to see separatism online. So this idea of, separate spaces, women's servers, and maybe that's necessary. I always like the idea of multiple actions, some of which are in conflict with each other, that kind of work their way out. And there's certainly a resurgence of liberal feminism. So, I run in circles where, women are hyperactive right now about, making their way into the C-suite, making sure women are represented in the tech industry, really pushing to our current liberal government and the previous government, the dismal numbers of women who sit on the boards of tech companies, and, very clearly, not as a, materialist, but saying the right thing, which is, women are consuming these technologies, and women aren't making decisions around what's being, produced. So I think that's a very vital space right now. At the same time as other kinds of activism is emerging, that's, definitely anti-capitalist.
One of the things that strikes, I think, when you look at the CV again, or the history of Sara Diamond, is this, a lot of us sit around talking about whether or not change should come from within or from without. And it's amazing to watch and see and hear the stories of someone who's done both kind of through their whole lives. So kind of just getting on with it and kind of, why not do both? It's kind of a wonderful strategy. So, and this brings up the idea to me of activists' orientations that are institutional, let's say, or at least organizational or unionized or what have you. And then the actions of individual artists and how much effect or agency you can have in that space. And it's also interesting how much of your own practice is kind of, I don't want to use the word hidden, but it's sort of within an institutional frame a lot of the time. So I could list off Citizens for the Right to View, the Women's Labor History Project, Amelie, Intermedia, all these things that you were kind of, in a way, it was your work, right? But it was being pushed from the standpoint of an institutional form. So I'm just curious, how do you make those decisions? And then it would be really interesting to hear how you reflect on that in the context of OCAD and a very large, sort of art school in Canada. So,
right, okay. Yes, I figured out at some point, partly because I did have this kind of grounding in as a historian, and I read a lot of economic theory as well as history and I guess historical methodology. That formations, institutions, creating envelopes as vehicles, even if they are not permanent. And that is something I have learned, is the value of impermanency. And I'm just make that a footnote, make sure we come back to it. But that process of institutionalization is really critically important for change. And so I guess I found myself an institution builder. And when I was very, very young, I was part of establishing, with Marshall McLuhan's son, Michael, the first free school in Toronto. So it was an alternate school, and I was actually part of navigating its way into the Toronto Board of Education. So I learned very early on this idea of, create alternate structures, formalize them. If they don't work, abandon them. Or, once you're into, stable institutions, you can abandon them. You look at how to shift and transform them, et cetera. And definitely the work I did at the Banff Center was fifth column work, like without question. And it took a while for it to be able to exist, sustain, maintain, and then be formalized and solid enough that it could really support the number of artists and in terms of production, co-production, and discourse that it eventually did, because it was very much not the structure of the Banff Center, other than having a residency component. So I think that that's something I've been very interested in, as well as how can, and I've studied, how can you create other kinds of institutional forms within traditional institutions that allow change to happen, and then how can those be generalized? So, I do a lot of thinking about institutions and institutional structures, and I'm interested also in, what is a feminist institution, and, it's not just that women lead, because women don't necessarily lead at all from feminist principles. I want to talk, I was rereading in preparation for this. I didn't subject people to yet another quote from that. I didn't from a quote from that book, but I was rereading an article I wrote in the 90s, or turn of the century actually, that was looking at the transition from media arts formations to new media digital formations, and some of the differences, and the sort of idea of trying in the new media world to do, some institutions simply added and transformed, but there was this idea of doing something that was more distributed, that was less formalized, that was more kind of tactical with multi-points of intervention.
I was going to ask about Occupy or something.
Yeah, and I think those practices are super interesting. It's just that we can never mistake those for other forms of activity that formalize and that, can take on the power of transforming a state. Like if that's a project, right? The Occupy movement's not going to transform the state, the U.S. government, right? Other kinds of political action will. It can galvanize people towards other sorts of activities. So I think that's, some of the very interesting characteristics of the time that we're in. And I've been part of creating formations and then shutting them down. And I think knowing when things need to die, we tend to get very attached and nostalgic to so anyhow, OCAD University has a set of very strong principles. It has ethics that it believes in, that we adopted as an institution 10 years ago when I led our first strategic plan, and that have been pretty consistent. But it's not to say it's without conflict, and not everybody would agree necessarily who are faculty there with some of the directions that the institution has moved during my leadership. It's been in transition to becoming a university. It has research capacity. That's another dialogue, but I think we've managed to, keep a kind of ethical framework around the institution and its values. It has a very strong value system.
Thank you. Another question that came to mind, well, actually I have an answer for you. Sadie Plant lives in the mountains of Switzerland, and I ran into her fairly recently. She gave a talk at Zurich. And actually that kind of leads into some questions I had about this. You just brought up the context of a kind of feminist technoscience. And she once sort of explained this idea to me as, at this lecture actually in Zurich. What would scientific objectivity look like if it were composed by those who were never admitted to the club of subjectivity in the first place? And so I'm curious, there's two things you mentioned in your talk, which this relates to. One is this regime of censorship that you alluded to maybe even kind of requested to bring up a little bit. And so, I mean, have we seen this feminist technoscience in action? Have we? Is it always to come in a certain way? And how do you presuppose that in the context of what you're calling a rising regime of censorship?
I mean, it's interesting to try and relate those two questions. I mean, there's absolutely excellent ongoing theoretical work by feminist scholars in terms of science and technology and understanding the ways that it's constituted and needing to understand sort of ontological and epistemic change. So, I mean, this idea that science does happen in the material world. So there are experimental processes, etc., and you need to have that process happening. Science is valuable to society. But I do think that there's ways of constituting even the questions that are asked, within research that are positioned. So I have problems with this notion of objectivity. I just don't, I think and it's something I retreat to as well and I have to say, in Canada with what was a government that, and we have a new government now, none of this is happening. The scientists were liberated on day one. After the election. But the fact that, scientists were not encouraged to speak or publish or go to conferences.
That was behind my question.
Yeah, I mean, that's phenomenally problematic. And scientists will say to you, well, we don't want to look at the context of our research within society and what it means, because that's going to be an inhibitor, to being able to undertake pure research, to be able to act objectively. And I have problems with that, I mean, I think you can do two things at once. Women do all the time, we all multitask in our world, right? So, you can have in your head ideas about consequences and ethics around research and undertake research that's challenging. You need to be able to keep asking the questions of the research, which includes, to some extent, having people around basic research who ask questions around applications and who look at applications. And I think there's a huge opportunity for feminist, science to look at that application space. I'll give you an example. My colleague Paula Gardner, who's left OCADU and she's at MAC right now, and she's a very interesting researcher. And she began to work with a group of neurosciences, and she's redirected their research to look at fetal alcohol syndrome. Like redirected that research, which was fundamental research, to look at that particular group and to look at how to empower kids with fetal alcohol syndrome. So that's very different. It's a completely different approach. And I would say that's, applied feminist theory, in the context of scientific research. Her background's super hybrid. I mean, she has a, PhD in communications. She has a psychology background. So, I mean, I think part of what's interesting, too, as we look at educating the next generation of scientists, what are the tools that are needed within that space? And I believe in hybrid engineering schools and science. I also, want to maintain the integrity of my institution and the importance of art and design, education. However, we have brought in a lot of science to our curriculum, and our students crave and demand more science, which I think is really interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. So we're going to go out to the crowd in a minute. Yeah? You want to do it now? Soon. And I wanted to at least presence. It's interesting to talk about Marshall McLuhan in the context of the discussions of race and feminism, because we all know he's a bit of a problematic thinker in some of these categories. But at the same time, just to have a dialogue with McLuhan a little bit, we had chosen some quotes before this session, and I asked Sarah which you might sort of have a quick response to. I'm going to choose one of those now. So this is Marshall talking about, as technology advances, it reverses the characteristics of every situation again and again. The age of automation is going to be the age of do-it-yourself. And so if you have any comments or... Yeah,
it's a bit of, a sort of somewhat simplistic dialectic statement, but and of course, McLuhan's ideas about how previous technologies are carried, but it is a sort of charming statement, and I think what is really interesting around it is how I'm not sure it's always a reversal, but we know that when technologies are set out and let out in the world, people will use them in unintended ways, and that's the most interesting piece in a way around technology. One of the most interesting pieces about how technologies flow and the kind of analytics, the materialist analytics we need. So there's also, of course, within human culture, a drive for sociality. So we've tended to take asocial, hierarchical tools and find ways of making them social.
Thank you very much. So I think if anyone has a comment or question, there are microphones sort of circulating or soon to be circulating. Would anyone like to ask a question to Dr. Diamond? Are you very tired?
Thank you very much for your inspiring talk. I actually have 3 points that I was wondering whether you could comment on. The first relates back to your work on pornography, and as we know from the current German political situation, I would be interested in your thoughts on the link between migration and pornography. My own experience traveling the world has been that, men have said, well, don't be surprised, you're a white woman, you're still the sort of dominant character, so that, men from other parts will look at you in that light, and I was wondering if you could comment on that. The second part is that you said FemTech is about distributed networks. There's something else which is growing, which is the blockchain. They're also claiming that they're, basing themselves on distribution, and when I look at it, I see a lot of hierarchy and I see one single strand. And the third thing is that I found very interesting what you said about the need for institutions. At the same time, I'm curious about your thoughts on nation states and post-nation states in a global era.
Okay, now this could be a whole other talk, but let's start with porn. Okay, a favorite topic. In all that work that we were doing, I was doing, because I was really working in that space for quite a long time, I never defended some of the qualities of pornography. I mean, what we were looking at was that the complexity of the experience of looking at eroticized images, and that women were active viewers. So, that part of the conversation around censorship was that you were not only depriving men of, or men who were self-identified as heterosexual men with imagery, but you were also impacting women, and that had never been part of that discourse. So, very much interested in what was, the sort of feminine gaze, the feminine erotic, and trying to look at that and construct that. Also saying we need to go to the source of where violent images are produced. These are illegal, unless they're enactments. We need to have a very strong legal regime of that and child pornography, of arresting at the source. This was not the era of internet distribution, although it was, pretty successful video distribution at a global level. I think the issues around, in some ways the issues have not changed. I mean, there is a fundamental need to educate around sexuality, around empowerment, for not just young women, but men, whatever gender and gender association. That I really think there's a need for almost more of an intervention in the online space. And I also think that there's legitimacy at points for people to hack and take down images that they find particularly offensive. I think that there's, you can have a debate around imagery that can happen without empowering customs officers and police who often don't understand the complexity of sexuality and desire. So it's a complex discussion for sure, but the regime of images in the online spaces are often sexist, brutalist, etc., and require, I think, a strategy that isn't about censorship, but is about intervention. So that's sort of what I was meaning there. I think, FemTech has grown. It started as a network of academic feminists. It still is in many ways. I mean, I think it's purpose-built. It's very much about, being able to provide the history, do the historical analysis, to provide tools. I think, is it hierarchical? I think the FemTech folks would say, yes, there is a sort of core group that's an organizational structure, but it's highly accessible as well. And then the nation state and post-nation state, well, we are in the Canadian Embassy. Yay. Yeah, I mean, I think that we live in global capitalism and, there's many post-national formations, some of which have, frankly, broken down, like, UNESCO and the UN and attempts to try and, and who knows what will happen with the EU. Good luck, everybody. We seem to face, increased pressures around balkanization and globalization. And I think nation states continue to have a very important role in our societies, including, and I know there's going to be a whole conversation about security, but, in terms of protect the feminist agenda, very hard to do without a nation state. Hard to do without health care, that's supported by governments, right? So, it's complex. It's a balance between those sort of globalizing forces and different forms of state. And I think the politics of democracy remain valuable. Yeah.
Does anyone else have a comment or question? One at the back here.
Yeah, just a very short question on your framework. You said you can't measure the direct impact of technology, it's not one-on-one, but there's a sort of mystification. What is this mystification you talked about, and would you like to demystify it a little bit for us?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was thinking of Bruno Latour's work, and then, the whole sort of science and technology theory that's kind of come up from that, around that technologies are built, and they're built for a purpose, and they're built, I mean, my interest is in, what are the intentions within the process of design, and that purpose is not always articulated to the users of the technology. So I think I'll just give an example, and they don't always have the exact direct effects that they're meant for. So I just think, because I work so much in the space of data visualization, and so many of the technologies that have been developed for industrial visualization applications are supposed to enhance performance, right? And so, what does that mean? And that whole notion of what performance enhancement means, and what kind of performance, and whose performance, and what are the other things that get, subtracted from other ways of being in the world when the focus is on performance, and other ways of understanding what even that visualization does and how it functions. So that's, I hope that's helpful, because there's like the intention, there's the technology, and then there's how it's kind of released in the world and how it gets naturalized in the world. And we don't, unless we're in an audience like this, we don't spend a lot of time actually, deconstructing technologies. There's sources, how they were built, why are certain computational languages dominant languages now? How did that happen? And it's not just that they're functional, it's that other choices were made. All that stuff. And I hope I was more clear than when I gave my talk.
It's definitely less mysterious. I think you get the question. Christoph has a question at the front.
Yeah, sorry to take up time, but I have a question on that note that I really want to address. And that's when you showed the earlier video work, like the hero or your heroine, you mentioned you connected that to the data visualization practices and research that they're involved in today, and kind of talked about it as a proto data visualization work. But you also mentioned that it was informed by a kind of an unscientific approach and an anti-realist aesthetics and a Brechtian approach. And that's where I see the link to the data visualization, or where I would like to see more links actually to, like maybe not in your practice only, but in general, like how can you perhaps break down this belief in data as being per se objective and the algorithms as neutral. And I think this anti-Brechtian or this Brechtian and anti-realist approach could help us there. So could you see a connection there?
I totally agree with you. So, yeah, let me just, I'll step back for a sec. So when I made Heroics, I was, already really a working historian, and I was using, I was very aware about the sort of formal tools and how you would conduct a kind of ethnographic study and set it up properly. What were the rules of engagement? How would you make sure that everything was sort of equalized? How would you sort of simplify your questions? So, I was using that as a framework, and almost playfully, almost ironically, and I did that in a lot of my early work, at the same time believing in it. So it was it turned out to be a very interesting piece of ethnography, actually, in terms of the conversations, with the women. And in my earlier work as a historian, I used oral history, and I collected a lot of interviews, and I did these vast charts, kind of using British historiographic methods of, things that I learned about the women and their practices, and it was a lot of data. And I was actually very interested in, and Canadian historians weren't doing that kind of work at the time. I was actually very interested, but didn't have the tools to really do the kind of statistical analysis on that data, and to kind of correlate it with other sorts of data sets. There's always been, and when I was a very young artist, I did these crazy performance pieces where I would sit and collect data about how many people went into the women's bathroom and how long they would stay, and how many people went into the men's and how long they would stay, and which gender went into which, and sometimes when there were crosses. And then I would make these artworks that were all based on all this data I would collect. So I've always been really interestingly obsessed with data. And I think what I'm describing is exactly what needs to happen with, data analytics, which is like, where did this data set come from? How was it collected? Why was it collected? There isn't, and I've written about this a lot, we don't see data as mediation. And data is not a thing in itself, It is a material, it's a medium, it's about something else. So I very much believe that kind of interrogation of the data set, how it emerged, how it can be used, and its structures is a really critical part of the data analytics space as it's emerging. And I mean, people are definitely working in that context, but I try and ask those sort of questions of subjectivity when I'm looking at data sets. Was that helpful? Okay.
So should we take, maybe I'll make one small little intervention.
And then probably people want to go have a drink.
And then we should go. Because this brings up the piece, this wonderful 1984 Heroics piece, where you kind of asked people for their ideas around heroism. And it makes me think to ask you what your version of, who is a hero and what is a heroine today?
I have to make a footnote and mention somebody who is very important in that work, which is an artist whose name is Stuart Marshall, who died of AIDS now quite a while ago, who was a really important mentor to me and a friend. I think through Stuart, Stuart created, and he did this very early on before other people, like people were doing this in Canada. Stuart created these reenactments of interviews that were very powerful, and they had this Brechtian quality. So you actually would watch the reenactment, and you'd be fascinated by how the structure of the interview worked. So I was interested in, I guess, that process piece with heroics, as well. And there were very many different kinds of heroism, but, in the women and a lot of everyday survival. But I guess, for me, the kind of definitions that really resonated were people who were able to take informed risks, and not put other people in danger while they significantly took an informed risk. So that notion of not endangering others, for me, was very important. If that makes sense.
Thank you very much. I think we all deserve the informed risk of a drink. Let's give Dr. Sara Diamond a warm round of applause.